Hello, John. Welcome to the Transformational Learning Summit.
Great to be here. Absolutely.
I'm really happy to have you here. I really enjoyed your book, The Journey Beyond Fear. And before we get into that, though, I would like to ask you, what does the word transformation mean to you?
Uh, well, it has many different potential meanings. I like to use the metaphor of the caterpillar and the butterfly. The caterpillar transforms into a butterfly. It's unrecognizable. You would never know that it was a caterpillar in the past. So for me, transformation ultimately is that process of change where it is so fundamental that you just have no connection between the two and elements. And I think that just as a quick thing, I I believe now virtually every large organization around the world has a digital transformation program.
Hmm.
And when I question the leaders about the program, what are they doing in digital transformation? They're applying digital technology to do everything that they've always done faster and cheaper. And in my view, that's making the caterpillar walk faster, and that may be helpful to the caterpillar, but please don't call that transformation until you
Hmm.
get to the most fundamental question of who are we and what are we trying to do. You're not in transformation. So
Hmm.
just a starting point anyway.
I really appreciate those questions, like who are we and what are we here to do? And I want to maybe open the context of this conversation around what is it about our time today and the dynamics that we're seeing in the social space um, that creates an opportunity to re-examine these questions.
Well, have been doing research for many decades now on the long-term forces that are driving change in our global economy and society. And I've come to believe that we're at a very early stage in what I call the big shift. It's long-term forces that are leading to a fundamental change in our economy and society. And it's been going on for decades, but it's still very early stage. We still have so much more ahead of us. And I think that it has many different dimensions to it, but one dimension of the big shift is on the one side, it is creating mounting performance pressure on all of us. It takes many different forms, but partly it's the notion of intensifying competition on a global scale, accelerating pace of change. Things we thought we could count on are no longer there. And because of all the connectivity we've created, a small event in a faraway place in the world quickly cascades into an extreme event and leaves us scrambling to figure out what to do next. So that's a lot of pressure. Any one of those would have been pressure, but all three together creates a lot of pressure. But the interesting paradox, and I love paradox, is the big shift at the same time is creating exponentially expanding opportunity. We can create far more value, far more quickly with far less resource than would have ever been imaginable a few decades ago.
Hmm.
So I think it's an interesting contrast of mounting pressure and exponentially expanding opportunity.
I guess this really dovetails into this whole context of fear and that mounting pressure translating to fear and in and catalyzing the necessity of a new way of being because we've never been in a social system that is under so much pressure with so much change that we really are forced to redefine who we are and how we operate as a society. So what does that mean as far as how we have to think about learning how to be?
Well, I think many different contexts or dimensions again, but you mentioned fear, and I think one of the challenges we face in the big shift is because of the mounting performance pressure, there's an increasing emotion of fear around the world. and it takes let's see what's the right way to frame this. I should be clear that what I'm talking about is fear of the future.
Hmm.
When we look into the future, do we see primarily opportunity or threat? And I believe, and I've been working with companies and organizations around the world, that increasingly we're viewing the future as very threatening, very scary. I don't want to go there. I'm holding on to what I have and uh, hope that the change will stop. So I think that the fear is a key issue that we need to recognize and address. And I think again, unfortunately, we live in organizations where the message is forget about the emotions, leave those at home. When you're at work, just do your assigned tasks and do it efficiently and reliably, and everything will be fine. I think we need to really pay attention to the emotions that are driving our actions and choices and recognize that fear is there. And while it's understandable, it's a very limiting emotion. And so, how do we find ways to move beyond it and cultivate emotions that will help us to achieve more?
Hmm. And what have you found in that territory? How do we cultivate ways to move beyond fear and to relate to our emotions in a way that serves us in moving towards a new future?
Well, how long do we have? I mean, I wrote a whole book on this subject, so I think we could go on for days on this
Hmm.
topic. It's you know, I'm an optimist by nature, and I believe we all have the potential. One of the pushbacks I get from people is, "Oh, come on, John, we have the amygdala. We're biologically motivated by fear, and that's who we are as human beings." And I recognize that, I acknowledge that, but on the other side, my question to anybody is, who do you know that has an aspiration to live in fear? I don't think any of us want to live in fear. We all have a desire to have more impact and excitement about the impact that we're achieving that's meaningful to us. And so I think we all are motivated. If we recognize the limitations of fear, we all have the motivation to move beyond it. And in that context, in the book, I talk about three pillars. And unfortunately, don't have the time to go into all of them in depth, but the pillars have to do with the boy. Now I'm blanking on the pillars here. We
I
went
know one of
to
them was about narrative.
yeah, narrative, passion, and platform. And the
Hmm.
problem or the challenge here is I have a different definition for all three of those pillars. And when I say narrative, everybody thinks, oh, you're talking about stories. No, I'm not. I have a very different definition of narrative. And based on my research, that is a key catalyst that can help people, first of all, to see the fear that is limiting them and how it's limiting them, but also to start to move beyond it. And then passion becomes the emotion, the excitement that can be cultivated and drawn out that will help us to really move forward and have more impact that's meaningful. And the platforms are basically ways of connecting so we can scale that impact.
Hmm. So is narrative about creating a different context for the emotion of fear?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, so let me be clear in my definition of narrative. I'll contrast it with story. For me, a story is self-contained. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end to it. The end, the story is over. And the story is about me, the storyteller, or it's some other people, real or imagined. It's not about you. In contrast, for me, a narrative is open-ended. It focuses on some big opportunity or threat out in the future, not yet achieved, not yet resolved, and the resolution hinges on you. It's a call to action to say your choices, your actions are going to help determine how this plays out and how it resolves. And again, it's complicated. It go into it in the book, but there are many different levels of narrative. I think we all have a personal narrative, even though very few of us have made the effort to articulate it to ourselves, much less reflect on it. And again, when I talk about personal narrative, I'm not talking about our view of the past. I'm talking about our view of the future. Is it primarily threat or opportunity? And what's our call to action to others to help us in addressing that threat or opportunity? But then I think there's also organizational or corporate narratives. I think there are regional, geographic narratives and movement narratives. So many different levels of narratives, but I think they all can play a significant role as a catalyst in helping us to move beyond the fear.
I think this question of a group narrative, whether it's an organization or a movement, is really significant in the way that a group of people can choose to shape the narrative under which they operate. Did you notice any specific examples of how certain movements or organizations actively shape their narrative?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing for me is when I talk about narratives in companies, the leaders all say, we have a narrative. You know, we began in a garage, we faced incredible obstacles, we overcame them, accomplished amazing things, more to come. That's our narrative. And my answer to that, no, that's about you. What is your call to action and an opportunity for the people you're addressing outside the organization, your customers? And there are very few organizations that I know who have that kind of narrative, but one that I cite because most people recognize it is Apple. Back in the 1990s, came up with a narrative that they condensed into a slogan, which was think different. But when you unpack the slogan, it was basically, you know, for decades, we had digital technology that took away our names, gave us numbers, put us in cubicles. Now there's a generation of technology that can allow us to express our unique potential and individuality. But it's not going to happen automatically. You need to think different. Will you think different? And it spoke to such a deep aspiration that many people had. I think it's the reason why for many people, Apple became the equivalent of a religion. They became so attached to Apple because it was speaking to them about an opportunity for them, not Apple opportunity, but an opportunity for the people outside of Apple. And so I think it's, yeah.
How does how does an organization today, maybe some of the organizations that you consult with, go about becoming aware of their current narrative and shaping it? Like what is that a conversation? Is that like a internal marketing campaign? Like what does it actually look like in practice to be to actually choose to work at that level of narrative?
Well, I think again, it's partly layers. I think until and unless the leaders in the organization at least have recognized their own fear and been willing to move beyond their fear and had their personal narratives evolve, it's going to be very hard to get organizational narratives to be effectively created. So it starts with the individuals, but as they start to reflect on their personal narrative, the question becomes, okay, what impact are you trying to achieve with the people outside the organization? What opportunity do they have outside the organization, and what action do they need to take? Not buy my product. What action do they need to take that will help them to address that opportunity out there? And recognizing that, again, many people outside the organization are driven by fear. And if you can articulate a really inspiring opportunity, an exciting opportunity that will motivate them, you will build an attachment, a relationship that will be very solid and enduring.
So that's like creating a new context that allows them to transform their fear or the pressure into a form of passion, because then there's an opportunity rather than some big ominous future that they're trying to avoid.
Yeah, I mean, it cascades. So if it's an opportunity for the customers that is really meaningful and exciting to them, it can become meaningful and exciting to the company and the organization to say, okay, what could we do to help that customer achieve that opportunity? Where could we play a role and what could we do? And then we're going to make a difference that's very meaningful to our customers. It's not just trying to get their money, it's getting them to achieve something that is very meaningful to them.
Mm-hmm. And the third part of what you're talking about is platform. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, again, I have a very different definition of platform in the sense that, everybody talks about platforms today. We're all ruled, governed by platforms around the world. Um, and yes, but the platforms that we have today are very transactional platforms. They're helping people to connect, to buy and sell, to have conversations. But basically, the platform that I'm talking about is a platform that where the primary design goal is to bring people together and help them to learn faster together. And here, I should be clear, I use words with different meanings. When I talk about learning platform, most people say, oh, you're talking about online video platforms where I can sign up for a course, a training program.
Mm.
No, that is learning in the form of sharing existing knowledge. And while I don't want to dismiss that, I believe in a rapidly changing world, the most valuable and necessary form of learning is learning in the form of creating entirely new knowledge, knowledge that never existed before. And that doesn't occur in a training room or listening to a lecturer. That occurs through action together with others and reflecting on the action and evolving the action so you can have more and more impact over time in ways that are meaningful but very different from impact that's been achieved in the past. And
Mm.
so I think that if we took that as the primary design goal, that's what we're trying to achieve with this platform, it would have a very different look and feel to the platforms that we have today and address a huge unmet need on the part of people. We believe all people need to learn faster together in the form of creating new knowledge.
Mm. And I love that distinction between old knowledge, like things that we already know, because so much of learning is the transmission of old knowledge. And that in a way is also disempowering. There's a person or an authority who owns the old knowledge and is the expert, and then there's everybody else who's receiving that old knowledge. And so the the element of agency of we're creating this together, we're discovering something new, we're actually like somehow participating in a learning process around new knowledge is entirely different. And I'd love to uh, maybe expand on this a little bit on the dimensions of what you're seeing in this new approach to learning about actually learning new knowledge.
Yeah, a couple of things that are related to this. And again, it has to do with definitions. And, everybody in the business world today is talking about skill building. We need to build new skills. And again, I don't want to dismiss that, but at least the way I define skills, it's something that's valuable in a specific context. How to operate this machine, how to do this kind of calculation in this business process. Those are skills, but they're valuable in that context. They really are not helpful in any other context. In contrast, I believe we need to focus much more on what I call capabilities. And here, capabilities for me are things that are valuable in every context. And they have to do with creativity, imagination, curiosity, collaboration, reflection. Those are things that could help us in any context to learn faster if we have the cultivate those capabilities, build those capabilities. And so I think that's another missed opportunity in companies. And unfortunately, too, I'll be a bit controversial perhaps, but unfortunately, I think many of these capabilities are deeply suspect in most companies today. It's the reason they're not well developed. I mean, curiosity. You're asking too many questions. Just read the manual, do the job as assigned. You know, okay, so I can't ask any questions. And I think
Mm.
it's a challenge to overcome is how do we really cultivate those capabilities and put them in the work environment. I mean, not just, again, I know we have training sessions where you can go to learn about creativity or you can learn about whatever, but until and unless you're actually applying it in the work environment, it's not going to be very helpful.
Hmm. And a lot of these capabilities also take on a relational dimension, the capacity to be with another person, to communicate clearly, even something like curiosity and the response, you're asking too many questions. Like that's a relational interaction. Have you seen examples of organizations or projects that are developing those capabilities in effective ways?
Yeah, I mean, there aren't many, but I think there are a few that are kind of interesting. There's one which is a um, a company, a clinical laboratory company that was facing issues in their call center operations. They were finding that their customers were getting more and more unhappy and leaving them, and they were finding that the call center operators were resigning at an accelerating rate. And so the head of the call center operations went to the organization and he said, look, um, two things. First of all, we're you're not going to be fired. We're going to keep employing you. But the first thing you need to do is go work with the technology department to find out how you can automate all the calls that you're getting that are routine calls that keep coming in and consuming your time, and get those to be answered by non-humans. So that frees up your time. Again, we're not going to fire you. It frees up your time to address the questions that we're getting increasingly from customers that have never been encountered before.
Mm.
And they're really challenging and interesting. And he organized what he called pods, but it was small groups of employees in the call center operations, around 5 to 10 people, who basically were focused on a specific challenging question. And how can we come up with more creative and helpful answers to those questions? And significant shift in customer satisfaction, significant shift in the retention of the call center operators. Now they were getting excited because they were actually making a difference. They weren't just doing something that any machine could do. It's and again, I'll just quickly say that I'm an optimist by nature, and I believe that technology can help restore our humanity. I
Mm.
believe that most of the work we do today, tightly specified, highly standardized tasks that are done repetitively, should not be done by human beings. They should be done by the machines. Good, because now it frees up the human beings to address new opportunities, new situations, and learn in the form of creating new knowledge. And that's a huge opportunity to, again, I believe we as humans, that's our nature, is to be creative and to come up with new answers and ideas. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of space to do that in the work environments that we have today.
Well, I think the interesting dimension of AI is that the promise of technology has always been to free up the human being, and until now, that hasn't been entirely true. People are more bound to work than ever. But the reality of AI is that it really is the first technology that offers the possibility of meeting that promise, of allowing a computer to take care of and understand mundane tasks that then maybe a human being doesn't need to be responsible for. And in that way, I know there's a lot of tension and fear around AI, but in that way, it offers an opportunity to be more human. I think that's what's really exciting about the possibility. Like there's the Terminator dimension of like this is an existential threat to humanity, but the other side of that, and maybe in some ways we're projecting our own fears onto, what AI is going to be because of this human orientation towards command and conquer. And so, of course, our technology is going to want to do the same thing to us. But I think the other side of that, if we can somehow live into it, is that AI offers us an opportunity to be more human again, to actually develop our creativity, our curiosity, to do more meaningful work, to connect with each other in more meaningful ways.
Yeah, I think the challenge, though, and again, I understand and sympathize with the people who feel the fear, is because when I talk to senior leaders of companies about automation, they only have two questions. How quickly can I automate? And how many jobs can I eliminate?
Right.
It's all about scalable efficiency, doing things faster and cheaper. And if I can get rid of people, great. How many can I get rid of? How quickly? Versus, no, now I'm freeing up that capacity to actually do things that have never been done before and create much more value in a rapidly changing world. That mindset, in my experience, is not here yet.
So how do we reconcile that reality? Because there's the reality of our economic system, which demands, shareholder returns and basically making more money, and then there's the possibility of our humanity, which involves, learning new ways to be and learning in entirely new ways and collectively sensing into future opportunity and future understanding in new ways. And somehow, in my experience, those can be two, not only are they separate, but they kind of push against each other in a way, because there's always this pressure to meet the economic necessity.
Yeah, I just, again, I want to be a bit careful because when I talk to executives about this, their response is, oh, come on, John, we're prisoners of our investors. They want short-term results, and so we just have to focus on quarterly performance and efficiency to get there, and can't afford to be distracted by bigger opportunities. And so my response to that is, I understand, yes, there's a lot of pressure out there, reason for fear. But on the other hand, when was the last time you went to your investors and articulated a really inspiring, huge opportunity in the future that could create so much more value than anything you have ever created in the past? And they would look at me and say, oh, I can't do that. That's too risky. They're just, the future's too uncertain. You just have to focus on the near term. And that's my response is, well, what do you expect investors to focus on? If they don't have that opportunity, all they have is short-term performance, and it becomes a vicious cycle. The more they focus on short-term performance, the more you focus on it, the more they focus on it, and it's a death spiral. And my favorite example as a counterexample is a friend of mine, Jeff Bezos, who went to his investors at a very early stage and said, if you're looking for short-term performance, I'm not the company to invest in. I'm targeting a huge unaddressed opportunity that's going to continue to grow for decades. He did pretty well for himself. So I think this is all, it's all connected. If the executives are driven by fear, and just one of the consequences of fear is you focus on the short term. You can't afford to be distracted by the long term. You just want to get through the pressure that you have at the moment. If you just focus on the short term, it becomes a very dysfunctional cycle for you and for the people you're connecting with, and stakeholders of all kinds.
Yeah, and in this context, we're talking about, senior executives at an organization, but I think this kind of fear-driven motivation is almost universally relevant, and in many ways involves learning new ways to be, learning new ways to respond to fear. And I know you're literally working on basically a learning type project that aims to address this, and I'm curious to hear some of your thoughts around the learning dimension of transitioning to a new kind of society.
Yeah, well, a couple of things. One is I'll just mention I've done again a lot of research for a long time around movements for social change around the world in different periods of history. And one of the interesting things, regardless of the period of history or the place in the world, the most successful movements for social change throughout history around the world have been driven by what I describe as opportunity-based narratives. They
Mm,
focus on a really inspiring, exciting opportunity that can motivate people to drive change. And that I think is something that is is missing in our world today, where when we drive change, it's all about the threat. The enemy's coming to get us. We're all going to die. And I give the example of climate change. The world's going to collapse. We're all going to die. We got to change. Well, guess what? The successful movements for social change have been driven by really inspiring, exciting opportunities. What is the inspiring, exciting opportunity that
mm,
could motivate people to actually take action and drive change and come together with each other? And that I think is what's missing in a lot of our discussions and conversation today. So
mm.
it's a challenge.
There's a quote that you shared in your book that really resonated with me along this thread of social and political movements. And I'm going to read it now, and I'd love for you to expand a little bit. Creation spaces are present in successful social and political movements throughout history, as well as environments in which we see sustained extreme performance improvement, like extreme sports and online war games. Although these environments are diverse, participants have evolved very similar ways of organizing to learn faster together to achieve more impact. The basic unit of organization is a small group, typically consisting of 3 to 15 members, who meet frequently to work on initiatives designed to achieve local impact. These impact groups then link together in an ever-expanding network of cells that can learn from each other and leverage each other's efforts. I love that. I'd love to have you expand a little more on what you're talking about there.
No, well, again, it's part of the research on movements. And I think that one common element in the most successful movements is this opportunity-based narrative. But another common element is this cellular structure. The successful movements for social change organize, as I mentioned in the quote, into small groups, impact groups that are really going to drive action and change. They're not just discussion groups where they sit around talking to each other. It's they're taking action, reflecting on the results, and evolving so that they can find ways to have even more impact. And I think that that's something again that is missing. It's I'll just mention that there's a great article by Malcolm Gladwell, who was writing about the evangelical movement. And he said, everybody, when they talk about the evangelical movement, they go to these massive churches on Sunday and video the preacher preaching to thousands of people. He said, that's not the evangelical movement. The evangelical movement is these small groups that come together at least once or twice a week, where they're focused on action and impact. And yes, they come together on Sunday to listen to the preacher, but the real impact of this movement is the commitment to action by these small groups that are coming together. So I think it's pervasive throughout movements for change that are having more impact. And so I think it's a missing element again in all aspects. I mean, I'll give another example that it's not business related, but one of the things I focused on was extreme sports to see how do these extreme athletes get to more and more impact and evolve more rapidly. And I spent time with big wave surfers. And everybody thinks about big wave surfing as kind of a solo sport. There's one person on the surfboard, that's it. They succeed or fail based on what they do. Yes, there's a solo aspect to it, but watch those surfers when they come back to the shore They are coming together into small groups where their passion and excitement about riding more and more challenging waves is is energizing them and motivating them to really come together and challenge each other and support each other in terms of how can we do even better against those waves that are out there. And I should say too, the example of big wave surfing is helpful in the sense that when you talk to a surfer who's paddling out to ride the next big wave, they're afraid. They know that people have actually died riding those waves, not just fallen off their boards, they've died. So they have fear, but they're paddling aggressively to get back out to that wave. Why? Because they have a very specific form of passion. I call it the passion of the explorer, that is exciting them and motivating them in spite of the fear to address a situation that's never been addressed before. And so I think it's an interesting balance in the sense that many people interpret I'm talking about getting rid of fear, eliminating fear. No, I'm talking about moving beyond the fear. Yes, you're going to have fear, but how can you cultivate that excitement about having more impact that will help you to learn faster and achieve much more impact over time that's meaningful to you and to others?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this focus on the small group element is also very resonant. It's something that we discovered in our own work when I started on this journey to really find a way to create meaningful connection online. What I realized at some point is that the way that people feel connected in a meaningful way is through small groups, and that one of the things that a learning experience offered is a reason, almost like almost like a passion reason for people to come together. There's something I care about, so this is the reason I'm coming here. And then there's an opportunity to weave in that small group construct to create the opportunity for meaningful conversation and exchange. I think one of the challenges I've observed with scaling small groups or somehow bringing that dimension into a community space is I guess along the lines of the logistical side of it, or what does it mean for information to somehow flow between small groups, or how do the groups have the motivation to continue coming together and somehow moving towards something? And I'm curious if that came up in your research at all. If you have a movement that wants to work more with small groups, or you have an organization that wants to somehow activate this form of I think you call it impact groups. Like what's a process for doing that?
Well, it's complicated. I don't want to suggest that it's easy to do. It's very challenging, but to me, again, the key element that's missing in a lot of the efforts to do this is focusing on emotion and focusing on a very specific form of passion that I mentioned, the passion of the explorer. If people are not motivated by this passion, they're not going to continue to come together. Fear is going to overcome them, and they're going to drop out and say, "This too much. I can't do this. Sorry." So the question is, how do you find people with this passion initially? And just go into a bit of a diversion for a second. I did a survey of the U.S. workforce. When I discovered this passion of the explorer as something that was so helpful in getting people to achieve much more impact, I said, well, how many people in the U.S. workforce have this kind of passion about their work? Turns out, best estimate, at most 14%, 14% of U.S. workers have this passion. 86% do not. But the good news is there's 14%. If you can find in the 14% and bring them together into these small groups so they can reinforce and amplify each other's passion and achieve more and more impact that's meaningful, now it suddenly draws the attention of other workers in the workforce say, how can I participate? How can I join? And I'm now excited about this because you're showing that you can get real results here. So rather than going in and just assigning people to the groups and saying you're part of this group, I'll also mention too, again, it's complicated. There are a lot of different elements that come together here, but the most successful impact groups are those where there's diversity in the participants. If they all come from the same background and experience and departments, good luck. They're not going to learn very fast because they're just sharing the similar kinds of experiences and perspectives, and finding people with very different backgrounds, different experiences, who have this passion, this excitement about having more and more impact. They're going to be constantly challenging each other, and challenging each other in a productive, respectful way, not trying to put each other down, but challenging each other because they all share a commitment to having more and more impact. How can we have more impact? And because they come from different backgrounds, they're going to come up with different ideas, and some will work, some will not, but there'll be much more creativity in terms of ideas than if you're just bringing everybody from the same background together.
Mhm. What does learning usually look like in a group like that? Is that a conversational process? Because again, we're kind of pointing at the difference between rote learning from a expert and receiving that information versus the discovery of new knowledge. So when you have this more distributed cellular structure, do you find that that quality of learning is usually something that's organic, just happens through the way that people have conversations, or that there's a process that these movements maybe work with, like a specific structure for the engagement of the small groups to somehow capture or structure this learning?
No, again, complicated. It's not, there's no simple formula, but part of it is making sure that people have passion, who are coming together, because they're going to be constantly focused on action. I think the big challenge in these groups, in my experience, is they tend to be conversation groups. Let's just come together on a weekly basis, have a conversation,
Mhm.
and then go back to work, do our work. No, throughout the meeting or the gathering of this small group, it's about what action have we taken? What results did we achieve? What do we learn from that? How can we, in our next set of actions, have even more impact? And now let's go out and act. So the conversation is all about action and impact. And it's a desire to constantly evolve so that they can have more and more impact.
Mm-hmm. It takes some discipline to do that, because I completely agree that that's the most powerful kind of conversation, where it's like, what have we done? What do we learn? What are we doing next? What do we want to learn? And then going out into the world, doing it, and coming back and repeating that process. Um, but it takes a certain level of commitment and rigor to continually do that. And I'm wondering if um, how many successful examples you've seen of this, or any recommendations that you have for the pitfalls of that process.
No, well, it goes back again to the question of motivation and the passion. You talked about discipline and rigor. No, I don't think it's about discipline and rigor. I
Mhm.
think it's about excitement. Are you excited about having more and more impact? Are you driven to have more and more impact? You're not doing it because you're disciplined and you were told to do it and you should do it. No, I'm doing it because this is my way to have even more impact. And I think that's going to be the issue, is how do we cultivate that motivation? Again, very few people have it about their work today, but it can grow. I mean, again, I go back to my example of the call center operators. When they started, they had very little interest in their work. They were just doing very routine calls and, checking things in the manual. But as they started to see that they were beginning to have more impact that nobody else had ever had, it brought out the excitement and it drew out the passion. And so I think that that's something that can evolve over time.
Is that usually a function of leadership, a leadership position that is building this narrative that creates excitement? I mean, obviously, there's different versions of an entirely decentralized movement versus a more centralized organization, but I feel like a key function here is that something somewhere is reinforcing a narrative that invites that excitement.
Yeah, I think that, again, for me, based on the research, it's the leaders being able to frame a really exciting opportunity, inspiring opportunity. It's very big and very different from anything that's ever been done in the past. But then, excuse me, it's about the leaders. I believe the most effective leaders in the future are going to be those who have the most inspiring and exciting questions
Mm.
and who will freely admit they don't have an answer and ask for help, because that sets a whole different culture in the organization. It communicates, first of all, the questions are not only okay, they are absolutely necessary. There's a huge opportunity out there. We don't yet know how fully to address it. Here's a really big question that we need to answer, and admitting you don't know and ask for help. Again, in the cultures we have in organizations today, you don't ever admit you don't know, and you don't ever ask for help. That's a weakling. You just do what you were told and read the manual. And that's the way to succeed. So if the leader is asking questions and asking for help, now it starts to drive the organization to say, wow, that's a really interesting question. And, I'm wanting to help. And how can I help? Let's come together and try to solve this and figure it out. So,
When you were at the early stages of your last book, did you have a guiding question before you? Like, I'm curious that how you even came to this inquiry into the area of fear. Was there a guiding question that led you to that insight?
yeah, I mean, it was throughout most of my career, I was trained as a business strategist, and I was taught to believe that strategy is everything. If you have the right strategy, you win. And over the years, I came to realize that it's less about strategy and more about psychology. That if we don't understand the emotions that are shaping our choices and actions, the best strategy is just going to sit on a shelf somewhere. And specifically in this context, I began to see, and my focus as a business strategist was on looking ahead and anticipating emerging opportunities in this big shift world. And my challenge was I would go to senior leadership and give them the research about these emerging opportunities. And I would find that their reaction was resistance, was basically dismissal. Just, let's keep focusing. We've got quarterly performance. Our investors are demanding. Just focus on doing the short-term action. And I began to realize over time that response was not just a mental response, it was an emotional response, a response driven by fear. And that if I didn't find ways to address that fear and overcome that fear, I was never going to be able to persuade people to address these huge opportunities in the future.
Was
So
that
that was
like
the
a was
challenge.
that like a sudden epiphany, or how did that crystallize into an insight? I'm curious. You've had this long career of dealing with these executives, and then somewhere along the way, you see a pattern that you crystallize into a particular insight. Like what was there? Was that a moment or something that built over time?
No, it built over time. I mean, there were many elements again that came together, but I've been in Silicon Valley now for over 40 years. And one of the reasons I was attracted to Silicon Valley, even though I didn't really articulate it at the time, was because in this area there's a culture of optimism, of focusing on opportunity. The people here, whenever you have a conversation with them, it's about the big opportunity. It's not about the terrible things that are happening. It's all about the opportunities that we can address. And it cultivated that passion and excitement about learning in entirely new areas and innovating, coming up with new technologies and new approaches. And to me, that was very exciting to me because it helped me to also focus on opportunities and um, but then realizing that, you know, if you go outside of Silicon Valley, there's still a huge amount of fear, and that's holding people back.
You have a particular, so earlier we just talked about the power of questions, and you have a, a process for coming up for with questions, like when you're looking at a project or you're doing some sort of research. I imagine that a lot of that revolves around particular questions that you formulate beforehand, and I find there's so much that a good question or a good collection of questions is probably more powerful than any kind of answer. And so I'm curious if you have a philosophy or a particular process for questions.
I wouldn't say there's a process. Again, it's about capabilities and motivation. I think
Hmm.
the capability of curiosity, if you have curiosity, you're constantly asking questions. You're constantly focusing on things you don't know that seem interesting and that you'd like to know, and asking questions about it so you can learn faster. And I think that that's, again, I'll just go back to one of the challenges that I see is that um, we have a very specific culture in large organizations. And one element of that culture is, what's the mark of a strong leader? A strong leader is someone who has an answer to all the questions you might have. Whatever the question, they have an answer. And by the way, if they don't have an answer, maybe it's time to get rid of them.
Really? Is that a prevalent mindset?
Absolutely.
Hmm.
No, and it's driving a lot of the fear, because when I can build trust with a leader and be in the privacy of their office, they will admit they don't have answers to all the questions, but
Hmm.
they can't do that publicly because they're going to get fired. And so I think it's a real challenge of how do you move beyond that. And by the way, I think, you know, again, we talk in all kinds of gatherings, I talk about surveys that show the erosion of trust in all of our large organizations, companies, governments, universities, media, whatever. Erosion of trust. It's happening around the world, increasing over time. Okay, what's the reason for it? When I ask that question, I get a blank stare. Whoa, that's interesting. And I didn't really think about that. I believe a key reason for the erosion of trust is we have leaders who are saying they have the answers to all the questions. And there are two possibilities. Either they have no idea how rapidly the world is changing, or they're lying. In
Or
either
both.
case, why would I trust them?
Hmm.
And I think, again, it's the need to make this fundamental shift in culture and
Hmm.
focus on emotions where there's passion and excitement about moving into areas that have never been addressed before, and admitting that you don't have all the answers.
Hmm. I think this lands back in this territory of learning, because our world has changed so much, and there's this things are changing so fast that we can't possibly know things that we think we know and things that we're under pressure to know. That it really requires a certain shift to recognizing that you don't know, being okay with it, and rather than trying to find an answer, living a question. And I think that really um, that's like a major paradigm shift for learning as a whole, because so much of how we operate is, there is information that is knowable, that is going to be transmitted to me, and then I will know it, right? And that's this worldview that we're born and raised in and nurtured to operate in. But the reality of what our world looks like today is that there is infinite information. Much of it you have no idea whether or not it's accurate or relevant. And you need to navigate in an environment of constant change and immense pressure. And that there's something there about, what does learning mean?
Yeah. No, and again, it's about motivation. Why would you do that? What, that's very scary to
Mm,
move into that kind of learning. And unless you're excited about opportunity, which is why I start with the question of what's the opportunity? What's the really big opportunity that we could be addressing, that we're not addressing, and that we
mm,
don't know all the answers to? So how
mm.
can we start to learn so that we can address that opportunity and achieve much greater impact?
It's interesting as you say that. This really dovetails in a very specific strategy that we use in our group learning experiences. Because for me, one of the attributes, if you're trying to create a relational experience, it involves a certain amount of commitment because it's not just someone that's giving you Netflix content. Like it involves participation, it involves possibly dealing with uncomfortable situations, it involves becoming present to your emotions and anything that might be there between other people and engaging with the learning process in a different way. And so that requires you to be motivated to do so. And so one of the things that we do at the beginning of a long form learning experience is we invite people to sense into what is the future possibility that is meaningful to you, that is alive for you somehow as a possibility through this experience. And so that is a process, this kind of future based orientation towards the reason that people are here becomes the foundation of the whole experience. I think I gathered something from your book also about this kind of future based orientation around creating a narrative.
Yeah, and I think that's again why I focus on starting at that place. And it's again at multiple levels. So in my experience, it's not just focusing on an opportunity for the business or for the group. It's not focusing on as a person, what's the big opportunity that you could be addressing and having much greater impact that's meaningful to you.
Mm,
And then what at the company level, what's the opportunity for the company? And is there an alignment between the two? Because there may not be, and you may need to go to some other organization where an alignment in opportunities. But if you're not seeing something that's really exciting and motivating, it's going to be very hard to bring out that passion that will motivate you to learn and take risk and come together with others. I think one of the reasons I put an emphasis on small groups, 3 to 15 people is kind of the formula I've come up with, is because those groups need to have deep trust-based relationships with each other in the
mm,
group, all the participants. And if you get much larger than 15 people, it's very hard to build that depth of trust. And you need that trust because you're going to be vulnerable to those people. You're going to be expressing things that you don't know and need help on. And yeah.
have you seen any examples of how that trust is built in small groups and particularly at scale? Like what does it mean to build trust in that context?
Well, again, it's complicated. It's partly around sharing passion. If you share the passion and excitement, you will start to build trust because you see the other people are similarly excited and motivated about having impact in that particular area. But
Mm,
it's also, I think, um, generally in the things that I'm familiar with, these small groups start with some kind of facilitator or a moderator who's working with the people to build that trust, encouraging them initially to ask questions, to be helpful to each other, to acknowledge that they don't have answers, and that's important to building the trust, and
mm,
that needs to happen very
mm,
early on.
mm. John, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate just how deep you've gone into this territory of fear. And I really enjoyed your book and just appreciate having an opportunity to unpack some of that in this conversation.
Well, thank you. I would certainly encourage for those who are interested. The book is The Journey Beyond Fear. I'm not sure we mentioned the title, but
Mhm.
Journey Beyond Fear goes into much greater depth on all these topics and is based on, again, long long periods of research as well as personal experience. Part of the book is my own personal journey over my life and the journey beyond fear and lessons that I learned as an individual, but it's also based on research of many other people over time. So
Yeah, and I love the the reflections on what you call cellular organization, basically like scalable small group structures inside organizations and movements, and then how that can land into a new definition of what a learning platform is. So I do highly recommend the book. Because I just feel like you did an excellent job. Also, just creating the language around some of these things.
thank you.
Yeah.
No, more to come. Again, as you mentioned, I'm in the process of creating a center that will help people with programs that, help them on the journey beyond fear. So I'm still learning myself and continuing to want to have impact. So it's great.
Amazing. Thank you, John.
Thank you.